All right, guys, this is Franklin Roosevelt and Shadow of War. This comes from Chapter 33 in American Pageant, but it's good, useful information for any pre-World War II stuff we need. I'm going to try to go as fast as I can because, as you might be able to see, there are 42 slides. So I'm just going to go quick and get you through it. All right, the London Economic Conference in 1933. The meeting was a representative of 66 nations at the Geological Museum in London, and its purpose was to win an agreement on measures to fight the global depression. The problem we're going to run into is that Roosevelt is going to want to inflate currency in the United States to help pull the United States out of the depression, and in turn, that is going to destabilize, right, the value of currency, and so in turn, it says right here, exchange rate stabilization essential to revive world trade. Well, if the United States is going to inflate theirs, right, which means the price or price of stuff is going to go up and the value of the dollar, right, is going to go down. If that's going to happen, right, then other countries can't sort of stake their stuff to it. We've already talked about hyperinflation in Germany, and so this is going to kind of lead to the London conference not being particularly useful. This slide basically says what I just said. Unwilling to sacrifice the possibility of domestic recovery for international cooperation, the conference collapses, and we start to see the movement as it soars right here towards extreme nationalism, which means other countries and the United States are going to put themselves first. Okay, the good neighbor policy. This is going to be put into action by FDR. The big thing about this is twofold. One, it's going to be a non-interventionist policy, so it's going to do away with the Roosevelt corollary. Let's see if I can find that on this slide here, right here. Okay, so we're not going to do that anymore. We're not going to intervene. It's non-interventionist. And the other big thing was it was all about reciprocal trade, meaning that we weren't going to provide trade that was going to be sort of bad for one group but good for us, that kind of idea. And in a sense, the idea was to be, yet again, a good neighbor. The big deal, or not the big deal, the change in this, right, is we've gone from Teddy Roosevelt's big stick diplomacy to Taft's dollar diplomacy, which would not be reciprocal trade. And now FDR is going to basically look more for partnership in the Western Hemisphere instead of trying to dominate the Western Hemisphere. And as it says right here, it's going to pay dividends for Latin America. This will also extend past, say, what we think of as Latin America, all the way down into parts of Brazil and whatnot. You can see here part of this good neighbor policy was to promote tourism. You got Uncle Sam here and the guy with the sombrero, or this 1940s Walt Disney feature about South America and Brazil and stuff. Also, as a side note in trivia, the term good neighbor was coined a century earlier by our favorite Senator Henry Clay. So remember, we're stuck in the Great Depression here in 1934, and so they're going to come up with the idea here of the Reciprocal Trade Act. And the Reciprocal Trade Act basically allowed the president to cut back on a lot of the Holly Smoot tariffs that were hurting the economy, and it allowed the, maybe I don't have it on here, but it allowed them to basically match, if a foreign country, because what happened with the Holly Smoot tariff is other countries then raised tariffs on their stuff. So the idea was, let's just say if the United States is exporting blue jeans to, say, Spain or something, Spain would then in turn would put a tariff on those, making it hard to sell blue jeans in Spain. And so what happened is if Spain took down its tariff rates on stuff, we would then meet that tariff and drop ours as well. And as it says right here, in the end, it helped pave the way for American-led free trade international economic system after World War II. So after World War II, the United States, as we know, becomes a global power. And in this, we push for the ideas of free trade, meaning like let's just get rid of tariffs because it's not helping anybody. Also, don't forget the points up here, right? the trade barriers choke off trade. Trade's a two-way street. And then this one right here, trade wars beget shooting wars. Okay, the storm cellar isolationism here. So the United States is going to want to stay out of Europe, right, following the First World War, not get suckered back in, much to the chagrin, right, of guys like Woodrow Wilson. The ideas, right, that the League of Nations could maybe stop this is maybe naive, but the idea would be that they could have some impact and influence in these countries. And these countries are going to, as your textbook will put it, refer to as like have-not powers, meaning that they're on their kind of down and out, and this is like a rebound for them. And in turn, they also, like the United States, not wanting to be quote-unquote suckers, they are going to want to be strong and powerful and ensure their safety. And so we see the rise of totalitarianism. Now, what totalitarianism is a political concept where the state recognizes no limits to its authority and strives to regulate every aspect of public and private life. A lot of times, totalitarian regimes, often have a dictator. They often have some sort of propaganda wing, and it leads to the ideas, oftentimes, of fascism. And we'll look at that more in class, okay? Because technically, not all totalitarian leaders are fascists. And a good example of this would be our man, Joseph Stalin. Stalin will be the leader of the Soviet Union right after the death of Vladimir Lenin. Stalin will kind of weasel his way and assassinate his way to being the dictator, and will purge basically anyone that is against his regime. Right? I cut out the statistics, but you can look them up. It was thousands of people were either outrightly murdered or sent to work camps in Siberia. Now, also, we're going to have the rise of Adolf Hitler. We'll talk about this more in class, but the fast version, right? Hitler will become a political leader following the First World War. He will try to overthrow the government. He'll fail. He'll go to jail. While he's in jail, he's going to write his famous book, Mein Kampf, and eventually he'll grow in popularity and come out. Now, as it says right here, he's the most dangerous because he combined tremendous power with impulsiveness, right? Hitler was pretty charismatic, and people were drawn to him. We'll look at this more in class, but understand that Hitler began to work his way into power, and he began to make basically allies out of groups like, say, the secret police and all that sort of stuff. And he's going to create a sense of terror in Germany, and that is going to help to consolidate his power. And we'll talk about this, like I said, more in class. But he said he will secure the Nazi Party by making political capital of the Treaty of Versailles. He's going to outrightly flaunt that they're not going to listen to it. He's going to help turn around their economy, and he will withdraw Germany from the League of Nations. A couple of things he's going to do: he will begin to increase the size of the German military. Some of it will be clandestinely, like secretively, and some of it will be outright, and yet again flaunting the rules that had been set for him by the Treaty of Versailles. In 1936, Hitler and Mussolini are going to make a pact, the Rome-Berlin Axis Pact, which basically is now going to set them up as allies. Down here we have Emperor Hirohito. Now, he's not quite a totalitarian leader because they had a constitutional government in Japan, but I threw him in there just because we were looking at the main belligerents, as you can see here. Not really Stalin, but in World War II. Another big factor in Japan will be Prime Minister Hideki Tojo. This political poster basically says, "Our last hope, Hitler," showing the sort of down and out people of Germany. Oftentimes, in the rise of these totalitarian regimes where the importance is placed upon the state, oftentimes they will try to hearken back to other stuff. So like the Eagles here to the Romans, the idea here that the powerful German military, and look at how powerful our country is, that kind of stuff. Yet again, we'll look at the rise of fascism and what fascism is in class. All right. We just mentioned Japan. Japan is going to also follow this international gangsterism, as your textbook calls it. They're going to resent the Engineers Treaty of Versailles. One, they wanted a racial equality measure put into the treaty. They felt they were being discriminated against. They felt insulted that it wasn't put in, but they stayed at the table. They also wanted more of the German territory in places like China, but got kind of half of what they wanted. So they are going to also begin to sort of thumb their nose at international agreements for peace and whatnot and accelerate construction of battleships and aircraft carriers. In 1935, they will join the Axis powers with the Tripatriot Act. Also in 1935, Mussolini will invade Ethiopia from Italian Somaliland and Eritrea. They will try to seize important resources in Ethiopia. Ethiopia will not be prepared for this, nor will they have the infrastructure to fight this, and they will be handily crushed. The League of Nations could have placed oil embargoes on the Italians, because that was kind of one of the big things going on there, and it would have hurt the Italians and maybe drawn them to be a little bit more peaceful, but they didn't, because yet again the League of Nations was weak. With the growing totalitarianism, fascism, nationalism, all that sort of stuff on the other sides of the world, the United States saw the sort of writing on the wall, and they didn't want to be involved, right? They saw the encircling sea, as it says right here, as their barrier, right, for Fortress America, as we'll kind of think of it as. They also are going to pass laws that says countries not paying their debts to the United States couldn't borrow any more money, and if they were attacked, they were going to have to hold out on their own. It says with the Great Depression going on, the United States really wasn't interested in paying attention to the problems that were growing on the other side of the world. Some historians think if the United States had gotten involved sooner, maybe they could have nipped it in the bud and we wouldn't have had a war. I don't know if that's true or not, but that is an opinion that is out there. Neutrality Acts of 35, 36, and 37, basically all trying to reiterate the idea that the United States will stay out of this war. They are not going to be involved. And it basically outlines certain things, like it says U.S. couldn't sail on belligerent ships, we couldn't transport munitions, we could no longer make loans, right? We really had to sort of distance ourselves from this growing problem. And the legislation abandoned the traditional policy of freedom of the seas, kind of meaning that like the United States could do whatever we wanted out on the seas, and now we cannot. From the time period, you can see here from everybody's favorite childhood author, Dr. Seuss, is a political cartoon. You can see the Hitler-type bird here pecking away all the trees, and it says England, Poland, France, Holland, Norway, Greece, all the places that the Nazis invaded, and it says ho-hum. When he's finished pecking down that last tree, he'll quite likely be tired. And the idea is that the United States is oblivious to the problems that are growing. Now, this cartoon comes out after Hitler has begun his aggressions, and the Neutrality Acts are before that, but the idea is that we kind of have our head in the sand and we're not paying attention. We see the ideas of the war in Europe and Uncle Sam looking across the sea and democracy pleading for him to stay out of the war because it's the last hope of democracy over here, right? Yet again, sort of an isolationist viewpoint. Should the United States go and ensure democracy? That's the big question. What we have going on here is the Spanish Civil War. Now, the fast version of this is that General Franco represented a fascist group. And so the other fascists, like Hitler and Mussolini, are going to give them war material, planes, guns, whatever, to fight the pro-democratic groups. Catholics in the United States are going to oppose the Loyalists. And what you're going to see is it's going to be like a testing ground for the Second World War. All right, appeasing Japan and Germany. So Japan will have full-scale invasion here into China, okay? And the United States won't do much about it. Roosevelt will continue to give aid to China by refusing, as it says right here, to call it a declared war. So it's kind of a loophole that he uses. He's going to give a famous speech in Chicago referred to as the quarantine speech. And this is going to upset people because basically the idea was to limit the spread of Japan, right? And the United States didn't want to have anything to do with any of this, right? All right, so we're going to get the ball rolling here more on European-based World War II stuff. But in 1938, okay, Hitler is going to want to annex the Sudetenland. Okay, the Sudetenland is the western part of what was then Czechoslovakia. And basically the idea was that ethnic Germans lived in the Sudetenland, spoke German, and weren't really Czech. So he just wanted, his whole mindset is that he wants to bring the German-speaking peoples under the German flag, if you will. Western democracy saw this as a rising aggression, but they realized that they were not prepared for war, kind of as it says right here. And so at the Munich conference, the British, the French, the Italians, and I forget the other country, it doesn't really matter off the top of my head, are going to basically give him half of Czechoslovakia in a form of what they refer to as appeasement. Now, the Czechs will actually be quite upset about this because they weren't even allowed to go to the bargaining table. This will be a huge black eye historically for the British and Europeans at the time. They thought they could appease Hitler. Hitler, being a maniac, as we know, was not going to be appeased. This is what sets the stage for eventually Winston Churchill coming to power in England. If you've ever seen the movie Darkest Hour, or I forget the other famous one, but the idea is Neville Chamberlain, this guy, proves insufficient and is willing to sort of make deals with the Germans when the Germans were clearly not going to live up to those deals. In a shock move, Hitler and Stalin are going to sign a non-aggression pact. As you can see here from this cartoon, it implies that the Soviets and the Nazis did not like each other, which is true. They both saw each other as sort of detestable. The non-aggression pact will help the Germans, because when they invade France, they will then have a Eastern Front that they won't have to deal with, and the Soviets will then stay out of the global conflict and be able to invade their neighbors. With the signing of the truce, it was kind of the last piece before the war got kicked off in earnest. In 1939, September 1st, Hitler will want to claim the territory of Poland that was taken from the Germans after World War I, and he will invade Poland. The Polish will not have put up much of a fight initially. They are still using horse-mounted cavalry. So against mechanized infantry, the Germans, it's gonna not really stand up. This will mobilize the rest of Europe for war, but as I said before, they were relatively unprepared. The idea here of the German war machine basically grinding up Poland. This sort of overwhelmingly massive aggression by the Nazis and stomping on freedoms of democratic peoples is going to upset the United States, so we will be overwhelmingly anti-Nazi, anti-Hitler. People will then begin to call for help for Britain and France, but not enough to get us really moving. The 1939 Neutrality Act will be a cash carry deal, which basically meant that foreign nations, namely Britain, will be able to get war material from us, but they have to carry it on their boats, and they have to pay for it in cash. Our neutrality was clearly favorable for European democracies. The United States not only improved its moral position, but helped its economic position by selling stuff to foreign nations. And the demand for war goods helped swing us out of the recession / beginning to take us out of the Depression and the decade-long unemployment crisis. Hitler will now turn to France and eventually invade Denmark and Norway. The Soviets will invade Finland, and this period of phony war basically wasn't like armed big war, but it will come to an end with the invasion of Denmark and Norway. The Germans will launch an invasion of France. Right along here is something referred to as the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line was a series of fortifications, basically bunkers, all that sort of stuff, that were stagnant. They couldn't move, but it was like a wall and super hard defenses for the Germans to get through. This was basically built on World War I ideas, okay? And the Maginot Line wasn't going to be useful in a modern war, right? And so the Germans, right, had developed the ideas of the Blitzkrieg, or lightning war, to have a fast invasion of France. And so what they're going to do is they're just going to go around the Maginot Line through Belgium and swing along the western coast of France. This was very reminiscent of the Schlieffen Plan from World War I. But in this instance, they're going to use paratroopers and mechanized infantry to never get bogged down and be stuck in trenches, and they're going to learn their lessons from the First World War. So what you'll see is they will roll through France and then hang a right and hopefully take Paris. They will also run the British Navy right up to the beaches of Calais, which will be the inspiration for the famous recent movie Dunkirk. You can see here the Nazis took Paris and they surrendered. Famous picture here of the Nazis walking by the Eiffel Tower. Government moves to fund the war effort, but goes short of actually declaring war. We will look at the Jewish atrocities from the First World War in class. War refugees, people from Germany seeking asylum, one of the most famous ones, right? Albert Einstein. Now, 1940, mainland Europe will be under Nazi control, and the British will be the last hope of democracy on mainland in Europe. And their island will allow them to basically stave off Nazi invasion. What the British are going to try to do is keep the Nazis at bay with their air force. They don't know this at the time, but the British secretly have developed radar, which will allow them to use their small number of fighters most effectively because they will know when and where Nazi attacks will come. Also, the British will be trying to decode Nazi messages with the Enigma machine, another good movie out on that as well. But the problem is that the British need help, and so Winston Churchill will basically plead all that he can with the United States to enter the war. Sentiment was growing to help the British, but not enough to push us to war. Roosevelt had the problem of, does he wait in a defensive posture and fortress America or enter the war or aid Britain without entering the war? In the end, we're going to basically do all we can to help the British. In the end, we get the Lend-Lease deal, which will be a presidential deal or an executive agreement, so it will go outside of Congress, which makes it legally questionable. And basically, the U.S. is going to give Britain old World War I destroyers to fight those Nazi submarines, and the U.S. will get naval bases, which the British had gotten during imperialism, and they will hold on to those for 99 years. So we will now be a much larger empire, and the British will have destroyers to fight the Nazis. Roosevelt will run for an unprecedented third term. And in doing this, here's the fast version. They were happy to re-elect FDR because they saw him as a good president. And as it says right here, if war should come, they wanted an experienced leader at the helm. You can see that he won by about 500,000 votes. Still, Republican Wilkie still had a pretty good showing, even though he didn't get a ton of electoral votes. You can see this is the slide where Lend-Lease comes up, but the idea here was this underlying concept of send guns, not sons, and billions, not bodies. What this did was to help with Roosevelt and his arsenal of democracy, right? Our democratic brothers across the ocean. And hopefully, as it says right here, keep war on their side of the Atlantic. A lot of people saw this as a blank check, and then they worried that the shooting declaration of war wouldn't be very far from what the Lend-Lease was as an economic declaration of war. You can see now where all the places that the United States began to send aid. It abandons any pretense of neutrality. Most Americans prepared to take the chance rather than see Britain collapse. This got the war production going, which enormously increased capacity. And when the United States wanted to get in the war, we were ready to go. With the fall of France in 1940, it wasn't enough for Hitler, and Hitler made the unfortunate or fortunate decision to try to invade the Soviet Union. much like Napoleon 100 or so years before, he will fail, and this will be the downfall of the Nazis. This will drag out the war. It will make it a two-front war for the Nazis, and it will get the Soviets involved, as we'll see in the next political cartoon, where it shows Stalin falling into bed with Churchill and FDR. Now, you can see here, we started in 1933 with the Economic Conference, and we are going to get to the invasion of the Soviet Union, which is in 1941. And as you'll see next time, we'll come back and look at the invasion of Pearl Harbor and some other political aspects.